Have you ever felt like you didn't belong? Like you were always on the outside looking in? Wrong country, wrong family, wrong past, wrong everything. Maybe you've sat in a room full of people and still felt utterly alone, like you're watching life happen to everyone else while you're stuck on the sidelines. Maybe you've carried a past that makes you feel unworthy, a background that feels like a stain, or a sense of displacement that no amount of effort can shake. If that's you, listen closely. The book of Ruth was written for exactly that person. It's not a story about perfect people or easy redemption. It's a story about outsiders, about loss, about impossible loyalty, and about a God who specializes in picking up the forgotten, the rejected, and the wrong ones, and writing them into his grand story. The Bible is full of larger than life characters, kings and prophets, miracle workers and warriors. But Ruth is just ordinary, a foreigner, a widow, a woman with no power, no status, and no hope. At least, that's how her story starts. But that's exactly why her story matters. It's a story for the rest of us, the ones who don't feel like we measure up, the ones who feel like our lives are just a collection of leftovers, the ones who wonder if we'll ever truly belong. Let's dive into her story, not as a dusty ancient text, but as a living, breathing message for anyone who's ever felt like an outsider. We'll break it down exactly as the outline lays it out. No fluff, no empty words, just the raw, unfiltered truth of a God who loves the outsiders. Most of all, the book of Ruth doesn't waste time with warm introductions or happy backstories. It starts with loss, total, devastating, life-shattering loss. Let's set the scene. Israel is in the middle of a famine. The land is dry, the crops are dead, and people are starving. Into this chaos steps a man named Elimelech from the town of Bethlehem in Judah. He's married to Naomi, and they have 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. Instead of trusting God to provide, Elimelech makes a choice. He packs up his family and leaves Israel, the land God had promised to his people, and moves to Moab. Now, let's pause for a second. This is no small thing. Moab wasn't just a neighboring country, it was an enemy of Israel. The Moabites were descendants of Lot, Abraham's nephew, but they'd long been hostile to God's people. They worshipped false gods, they practiced idolatry, and they were seen as unclean by the Israelites. For Elimelech to take his family to Moab wasn't just a move to escape famine. It was a step away from God, a choice to become an outsider in his own right. He went from being a member of God's covenant people to a stranger in a foreign land. And that choice would set in motion a chain of events that would cost him everything. In Moab, Elimelech and Naomi settle down, and their 2 sons grow up. They marry Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. For a while, things seem to stabilize. But then, tragedy strikes. First, Elimelech dies. Naomi is left a widow, stuck in a foreign land, with 2 foreign daughters-in-law. But the heartbreak doesn't stop there. Soon after, Mahlon and Chilion, her only sons, die too. In the span of a few short years, Naomi loses her husband, her sons, her home, and her hope. She goes from having a family, a future, and a place to belong to having nothing. Absolutely nothing. Can you imagine that pain? To lose everyone you love, to be stranded in a country that's not your own, to have no one to care for you and no way to provide for yourself. And in her grief, she says something that cuts to the core of human suffering. Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, bitter. Naomi means pleasant or sweet, but Mara means bitter. She's not just expressing sadness, She's renouncing her identity. She's saying, "The person I was is gone. All that's left is bitterness." This is a crucial point about the book of Ruth. It doesn't sugarcoat pain. It doesn't start with a happy ending or a hopeful promise. It starts with raw, unfiltered suffering. It acknowledges that life is hard, that loss is real, and that bitterness is a natural response when everything falls apart. So many of us try to pretend we're okay when we're not, to put on a brave face when our hearts are breaking. But Ruth's story says, it's okay to be bitter. It's okay to grieve. It's okay to admit that you've lost everything, because God doesn't meet us in our perfection. He meets us in our brokenness. Naomi decides to go back to Bethlehem. She's got nothing left in Moab, so she figures she might as well return to her homeland, even if she has no one there to welcome her. She turns to Orpah and Ruth and tells them to go back to their families. "Go home," she says. "Your husbands are dead, so you have no reason to stay with me. Go back to your mother's houses, and may the Lord show you kindness, just as you have shown kindness to me and to your dead husbands." It's a compassionate request. She doesn't want these young women to waste their lives caring for a bitter, empty old woman. She wants them to have a chance at a better life, a life with family, with hope, with belonging. And here's where the story takes its first turn. Orpah listens. She cries. She hugs Naomi goodbye, and then she goes home. Can we blame her? It's the reasonable choice. It's the logical choice. She's young. She's a Moabite. And staying with Naomi means a life of poverty, of being an outsider, of caring for a woman consumed by bitterness. Orpah's choice makes sense. But Ruth's choice is impossible. When Naomi tells Ruth to go home, Ruth doesn't hesitate. She doesn't cry and then leave. She doesn't weigh her options. She simply says one of the most powerful statements of loyalty in the entire Bible, a statement that has echoed through the centuries, a statement that defines her character and her faith. "Do not urge me to leave you or to turn back from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." Ruth 1:16, phase 17. Let's unpack this, because it's not just a nice sentiment, it's a radical, life-altering choice. First, Ruth is a Moabite. She was born in Moab, raised in Moab, and worshipped the gods of Moab. Israel is a foreign country to her, a country that hates her people. The Israelites viewed Moabites as unclean, as enemies, as people who were not part of God's covenant. When Ruth says, "Your people shall be my people," she's renouncing her own identity, her own culture, her own heritage. She's choosing to become an outsider in her own country, so she can stay with a woman who has nothing to offer her. Second, she's choosing to follow a God she doesn't yet fully know. When she says, "Your God, my God," she's turning her back on the false gods of Moab and committing herself to the God of Israel, a God she's only heard about, a God who allowed her husband to die, a God who allowed her mother-in-law to be consumed by bitterness. She's not choosing God because he's given her blessings. She's choosing God because of the loyalty she feels to Naomi. That's unheard of. Most of us follow God when things are good, when he's answering our prayers, when life is easy. But Ruth follows God when everything is hard, when there's no hope in sight, when the only thing she has to gain is more suffering. Third, she's making a lifelong commitment, a commitment unto death. "Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. She's not saying, I'll stay with you until things get better, or I'll help you get back on your feet, and then I'll go home. She's saying, I'm with you forever, no matter what, even if it costs me my life. That's the kind of loyalty that barely exists in our world today. A loyalty that's not based on what we can get, but on who we are called to be. Why is this so unusual? Because Ruth has nothing to gain from this choice. Naomi is bitter. She's poor. She's an outcast in her own homeland. Ruth is young. She's capable. She could go back to her family and remarry, have children, and live a comfortable life. But she chooses Naomi. She chooses the hard path. She chooses to be an outsider twice over, an outsider in Israel, and an outsider among her own Moabite family. This is where we encounter the Hebrew word hesed, a word often translated as loving kindness or steadfast love. Yet it means so much more than that. Hesed is loyal love, covenantal love, love that keeps its promises even when it's hard, even when it's costly, even when the other person doesn't deserve it. It's the kind of love that God has for his people, a love that never gives up, never lets go, never abandons. And Ruth is living out hesed in her relationship with Naomi. She's not just being kind to Naomi, she's being loyal to her in a way that mirrors God's loyalty to Israel. Think about it. God made a covenant with Israel. He promised to be their God, to protect them, to provide for them, even when they turned away from him, even when they were unfaithful. That's hesed, and Ruth is doing the same for Naomi. She's making a covenant with her, a covenant of loyalty, a covenant of love, a covenant that will not be broken by hardship or loss. As the outline says, she became a picture of grace before she ever experienced it fully. Ruth didn't have it all together. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't even fully understand the God she was committing herself to. But she chose loyalty anyway, and in that choice, she reflected God's grace to a world that desperately needed it. We live in a world that values self-preservation above all else. We're told to look out for number one, to do what's best for ourselves, to cut our losses when things get hard. But Ruth's story challenges that. It tells us true loyalty isn't about what we gain, it's about who we are. It tells us that sometimes the most faithful thing we can do is to stand with someone who has nothing to offer us, to love them, to care for them, to stay with them, even when it's hard. And in that, we become a picture of God's grace to the world. So Ruth and Naomi arrive in Bethlehem. It's harvest time, a time of plenty for those who own land, but a time of struggle for those who do not. Naomi is too old to work, and Ruth has no money, no family, no status. So Ruth does what any outsider, any poor person, any widow would do in that time. She goes to the fields to glean. Let's make sure we understand what gleaning is, because it's a crucial detail that reveals just how low Ruth has fallen, and just how faithful God is to provide for the marginalized. Gleaning was a God-ordained system in Israel, laid out in the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy. The law commanded farmers to leave the corners of their fields unharvested, and not to go back to pick up any grain that fell during harvesting. These leftovers were reserved for the poor, the widows, the orphans, and the foreigners, the people who had no other way to sustain themselves. It was a way of ensuring that even the most vulnerable members of society had enough to eat. It was God's way of saying, I see the outsiders, I see the forgotten, I will provide for them. Ruth knew her place. She knew she was an outsider, a Moabite, a widow, a poor woman. She didn't demand respect. She simply went to the fields, knelt down, and picked up the leftovers. The grain that the harvesters had dropped the grain no one else wanted. She worked from dawn till dusk, day after day, just to gather enough grain to feed herself and Naomi. It's a humbling image, a young woman, far from home, working tirelessly for scraps, just to survive. But here's the thing. Ruth didn't just pick any field. She happened to pick a field belonging to a man named Boaz. Boaz was a wealthy landowner, a man of standing in Bethlehem, a descendant of Judah, one of the most prominent families in Israel. He was a good man, a godly man, a man who feared the Lord. And one day, as he was walking through his fields, he noticed Ruth. Now, let's be clear. Boaz didn't notice Ruth because she was beautiful. The Bible says nothing about Ruth's appearance. It never describes her as attractive or charming or anything of the sort. Boaz noticed Ruth because of her character. He had heard about her, heard about how she had left her family, left her country, left her God. He had heard about her loyalty, her kindness, her hesed, and that's what caught his attention. Think about that. In a world that judges people by their appearance, their status, their background, Boaz judged Ruth by her heart. He saw her faithfulness, her humility, her courage, and he respected her for it. He went up to her and said, "May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Ruth 2:12, ESV, that phrase, "under whose wings you have come to take refuges," is full of deep meaning. In the Old Testament, God is often described as a mother bird, gathering her chicks under her wings to shelter and protect them. It's a symbol of safety, provision, and belonging. Boaz is acknowledging that Ruth has come to Israel, not as an enemy, not as an outsider, but as someone seeking refuge in the Lord. He's recognizing her faith, even though she's a Moabite, even though she's a widow, even though she's poor. He sees her as a child of God, not an outsider. But Boaz didn't stop at kind words. He took action. He told his harvesters to be kind to Ruth, to let her glean even among the grain bundles, not just the scattered leftovers. He told them to drop extra grain on purpose, so she would have more than enough to eat. He even invited her to eat with him and his workers, to share in their meal. This was unheard of. A wealthy, prominent Israelite treating a Moabite widow as an equal. It went against everything the Israelites believed about foreigners. But Boaz didn't care about man, made rules, or cultural prejudices. He cared about showing kindness to the vulnerable, honoring Ruth's loyalty, and reflecting the heart of God. This is the key turning point in Ruth's story. The outsider, the widow, the foreigner, the one gathering scraps, was seen and honored by one of the most respected men in Israel. She didn't earn it. She didn't deserve it. She had no status or power to offer Boaz, but he chose to honor her anyway. And this is where the modern connection hits close to home. How many of us feel like Ruth, like we're just picking up leftovers in someone else's field, like we're not good enough, not worthy enough, not qualified enough to be seen, to be honored, to belong. We look at other people's lives, their success, their relationships, their blessings, and we feel stuck with nothing but scraps. We think, I'm not from the right family, I don't have the right education, I've made too many mistakes, I'm too broken. We feel like outsiders, like we don't belong anywhere, but Ruth's story tells us, God doesn't see you the way the world sees you. The world sees your background, your mistakes, your brokenness, but God sees your heart. He sees your faithfulness, your loyalty, your willingness to keep going, even when things are hard. He doesn't care about your past, your status, or where you're from. He cares about you, the real you, the broken you, the outsider you. And just as Boaz saw Ruth and honored her, God sees you and wants to honor. He doesn't want you to live on scraps. He wants you to have a seat at his table. Ruth continued to glean in Boaz's field for the rest of the harvest. She worked hard, stayed humble, and kept her focus on caring for Naomi. Little did she know, this humble act of gleaning, this act of surviving on leftovers, was leading her to something far greater than she could have ever imagined. It was leading her to redemption, to belonging, to a future she never could have dreamed of. As Ruth and Naomi settled into life in Bethlehem, Naomi began to realize there was a way for Ruth to have a better future, a way for her to be redeemed. This is where we encounter one of the most important concepts in the Old Testament, the Kinsman-Redeemer, or Goel in Hebrew. Let's break down what a Goel is, because it's essential to understanding Boaz's role in Ruth's story and God's bigger plan. In ancient Israel, the Goel was a close relative who held a legal obligation to redeem a family member in crisis. This could mean buying back land sold out of poverty, freeing a family member sold into slavery, or marrying the widow of a deceased brother to preserve the family line. The Goel was the one who stepped in when someone was helpless, when they had no one else to turn to, and made things right. He was the rescuer, the protector, the restorer of what was lost. Naomi knew Ruth was entitled to a Goel. Elimelech, her husband, had owned land in Bethlehem, and since he and his sons were dead, Ruth, as the widow of one of his sons, held a claim to that land. More than that, she needed someone to redeem her, to give her a home, a family, a future. So Naomi told Ruth about the Goel, and told her there was a man who was a close relative of Elimelech, a man with both the right and the obligation to redeem her. Ruth followed Naomi's instructions. She went to Boaz at the threshing floor, a place where farmers separated grain from chaff, a place of labor, provision, and community. She waited until Boaz had finished his work, then lay down at his feet. This was a symbolic act in ancient Israel, a way of asking for protection, redemption, and marriage. It was a vulnerable act, a humble act, an act of faith. Boaz was surprised, but he understood what Ruth was asking. He told her he was willing to be her Goel. But there was a problem. There was another man who was a closer relative of Elimelech than Boaz. That man held the first right to redeem Ruth. Boaz could only redeem her if the closer relative refused. So Boaz called the closer relative to a meeting with the elders of Bethlehem. He explained the situation. Elimelech's land was up for sale, and Ruth, the widow of his son, was available to be redeemed. The closer relative had the first choice. If he redeemed the land, he must also marry Ruth to keep the family line alive. At first, the closer relative was interested. He wanted the land. It was a good investment. But when he heard he had to marry Ruth, he changed his mind. Why? Because Ruth was a Moabite. Because marrying her would mean taking in a foreigner. A widow, someone who would bring shame to his family. Because it would be costly, not just financially, but socially. So he said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I endanger my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Ruth 4-6. ESV, this is a powerful moment. The closer relative had the legal obligation to redeem Ruth. He had the right, he had the means, yet he refused. Why? Because it was inconvenient, because it was costly, because it brought him no personal benefit. This is the flaw of the law. The law can demand obedience, but it cannot change hearts. The law can set rules, but it cannot make people love. The closer relative followed the letter of the law when it benefited him, but ignored it when it did not. He could not do what was right because his heart was focused only on himself. But Boaz was different. When the closer relative refused, Boaz stepped forward. He was willing to pay the price. He was willing to marry Ruth, a Moabite widow, an outsider, even though it was not his strict legal obligation. He was willing to take on her past, her social status, her vulnerability, not because he had to, but because he wanted to, because he loved her, because he saw her true worth. This is where we see the theological core of Ruth's story. Boaz is a picture, a prefiguration of Jesus Christ, our kinsman-redeemer. Let's break down the parallels, for they are striking, and they are why this story matters so much to us today. First, Boaz was qualified to redeem. He was a righteous man, a man of integrity, a man who feared the Lord. He had no sin, no blemish. He was worthy to be a redeemer. In the same way, Jesus is qualified to redeem us. He is perfect, sinless, holy, the only one who can pay the price for our sin. He is the only one with the right to rescue us. Second, Boaz redeemed Ruth out of love, not obligation. The closer relative refused because it was a burden. But Boaz chose to redeem because he loved Ruth. He did not do it for personal gain. He did it to restore her, to give her a future, to make her part of his family. In the same way, Jesus did not redeem us because he had to. He did it because he loved us. He died on the cross not out of obligation, but because he wanted to save us from our sin, restore us to God, and give us a new life, a new family. Third, Boaz brought an outsider into the covenant family. Ruth was a Moabite, someone excluded from God's covenant with Israel. But Boaz married her, welcomed her into his family, and made her part of God's people. In the same way, Jesus brings outsiders into his covenant family. We were once outsiders, sinners separated from God, excluded from his kingdom. But Jesus redeemed us, adopted us as his children, and made us part of his family. It does not matter where we're from, what we've done, or how broken we are. Jesus welcomes us in. As the outline says, Boaz didn't just rescue Ruth. He gave her a name, a home, and a future. Before Boaz, Ruth was a nobody, a foreign widow, a gleaner, an outsider. But after Boaz redeemed her, she had a new name, Mrs. Boaz. She had a new home, Boaz's house in Bethlehem. She had a new future, a family, a legacy, a place to truly belong. That's what Jesus does for us. He doesn't just rescue us from our sin. He gives us a new name, child of God, a new home, his kingdom, and a new future, eternal life with him. He takes the outsiders, the forgotten, the broken, and writes us into his story. He makes us belong. Boaz and Ruth married, and soon Ruth gave birth to a son. They named him Obed. And here's where the story takes an unexpected turn, one that reveals God's amazing plan, a plan that stretches far beyond Ruth and Boaz, a plan that points to the coming of the Messiah. Obed grew up and had a son named Jesse. Jesse had a son named David, the great king of Israel, a man after God's own heart. David unified Israel, wrote the Psalms, and embodied God's faithfulness. But here is the profound truth. Ruth, the Moabite widow, the outsider, is David's grandmother. She is part of Israel's royal lineage. She, a foreigner with nothing, became an ancestor of Israel's greatest king. And it doesn't end there. Fast forward hundreds of years to the New Testament. In the first chapter of Matthew, we read the genealogy of Jesus Christ, a list of names, fathers and sons, kings and commoners, heroes and sinners, and right in the middle of that list is the name Ruth, Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king. Matthew 1-5-6 ESV. Let that sink in. A Moabite widow, someone excluded from God's people, an outsider with no hope, is in the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the Savior of the world. God didn't just redeem Ruth, He placed her in the very lineage that would bring forth the Messiah. He took the most unlikely person and put her at the center of His redemptive plan. This is the beauty of God's plan. He does not choose the powerful, the perfect, the popular. He chooses the outsiders, the broken, the forgotten. He uses the ones no one else would use to fulfill His greatest purposes. Ruth was a Moabite, a widow, a gleaner, yet God used her to pave the way for the Messiah. She was an outsider, but God wrote her into His story in the most profound way possible. And what about Naomi? Remember Naomi, the woman who called herself Mara, the bitter one. After Ruth gave birth to Obed, something wonderful happened. The women of Bethlehem came to Naomi and said, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer. And may His name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life, and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law. In-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Ruth 4:14-15. As for Naomi's bitterness was gone. She was no longer Mara. She was Naomi again, sweet, pleasant. She took Obed into her arms and cared for him. And in that, she found hope again. She found purpose again. She found joy again. The woman who had lost everything, her husband, her sons, her home, her hope, was fully restored. She was no longer an outsider. She was a grandmother, part of a family, part of God's plan. This is the power of redemption. It doesn't only change the life of the one being redeemed, it changes the lives of everyone around them. Ruth's redemption brought hope to Naomi. Boaz's obedience brought joy to the people of Bethlehem, and God's plan brought salvation to the entire world. The ending of Ruth's story is the ending no one saw coming. No one would have looked at Ruth, the Moabite widow, and thought, "She will be an ancestor of the Messiah." No one would have looked at Naomi, the bitter widow, and thought, "She will find joy again." No one would have looked at Boaz, the wealthy landowner, and thought, "He will marry a foreign widow and change the course of history." But that's who God is. He takes the impossible, the unlikely, the unexpected, and turns it into something beautiful. As the outline says, the God of Israel specializes in writing outsiders into His story. He did it for Ruth. He did it for Naomi. He did it for Rahab, another outsider in Jesus' genealogy. And He does it for you. No matter how much of an outsider you feel, no matter how broken your past, no matter how hopeless your situation, God wants to write you into His story. He wants to take your pain, your loss, your brokenness, and turn it into something. He wants to give you a future, a hope, a place to belong. Let's go back to the question we started with. Do you feel like an outsider? Like your past disqualifies you? Like you're just picking up leftovers in someone else's field? Maybe you've felt that way your whole life. Maybe you've made mistakes you think are unforgivable. Maybe you've been hurt, abandoned, rejected, and you can't see how you could ever belong. Maybe you look at your life and think, "I'm not good enough for God. I'm not worthy of His love. I'm just an outsider." If that's you, listen closely. Ruth's story was written exactly for people like you. Ruth was an outsider. She had a past that would have disqualified her in the world's eyes. She was picking up leftovers in someone else's field, but God saw her. He loved her. He redeemed her. He wrote her into His story. You are not too broken for God. You are not too far gone. You are not an outsider to him. He sees you. He knows your pain. He knows every mistake you've made, every hurt you've felt, every time you've felt like you don't belong. And he loves you anyway. There is a kinsman, Redeemer. His name is Jesus. He is the one who stepped in when no one else would. He is the one who paid the price for your sin, your brokenness, your outsider status. He didn't have to. He chose to because he loves you, because he wants you to belong, because he wants to give you a name, a home, a future, just as Boaz gave to Ruth. Jesus doesn't care about your background. He doesn't care about your mistakes. He doesn't care about where you're from or what you've done. He cares about you, the real you, the broken you, the outsider you. He wants to take you by the hand and lead you into his family. He wants to take your leftovers and turn them into a feast. He wants to take your bitterness and turn it into sweetness. He wants to take your sense of displacement and turn it into a sense of belonging. Ruth's story isn't just an ancient tale. It's a story about you. It's a story about God's relentless love for the outsiders, the forgotten, the broken. It's a story about redemption, about hope, about belonging. It's a story that says, no matter how much you feel like you don't belong, God has a place for you. No matter how broken your past, God has a future for you. No matter how alone you feel, God is with you. So if you're feeling like an outsider today, know this: you are exactly who God is looking for. He specializes in writing people like you into his story. He did it for Ruth, and he will do it for you. There is a kinsman, Redeemer, and he has already paid the price. All you have to do is come to him. Just as you are, broken and imperfect, an outsider and a sinner, and let him redeem you, let him love you, let him give you a place to belong. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to have it all together. You don't have to earn his love. You just have to come. Because God's love isn't based on what you do. It's based on who he is. And he is a God who loves outsiders. He is a God who redeems the broken. He is a God who writes us into his story. One unlikely life at a time. That's the story of Ruth. That's the story of God. And that's your story too. If you let it be.